Hello, and welcome to the February 21st program sponsored by the League of Women Voters Grand Traverse Area in partnership with the Traverse Area District Library, which hosts us here in this nice location, and with the Traverse Area Community Media, which offers technology and media support. Our focus today is on the powers and responsibilities of local government in Michigan. I am League member Eunice Crockett, your moderator for today's program. The League of Women Voters is a national, nonpartisan organization. The League does not endorse or oppose candidates or political parties, but does work to obtain and distribute information to the public about candidates and their views. The League promotes the informed and active participation of all citizens in government. It works to increase the understanding of major public policy issues through education and advocacy. Membership in the League is open to women and men of all ages, and we offer special discounts to students. Our program today is being shown on channel 189 with Spectrum Cable in Northwest Lower Michigan on the League of Women Voters Grand Traverse Area Facebook page, on Traverse Area District Library YouTube, and of course here in person. Today we welcome Mr. Paul Amrhein. He teaches and consults on topics related to extraordinary governance with nonprofits and local government, primarily in northern Michigan. He is based in the Grand Traverse County, Michigan State University Extension Office. Mr. Amrhein has been a co-leader of Michigan State University's Extension's Governmental Education Office for nearly 25 years. His prior experience is nonprofit organizational management, agriculture, and broadcasting. He holds a BA and an MBA from MSU. Did I miss anything? Okay. The program today will cover local government in Michigan. What is it? How did we get here? What is next? With a focus on county government. Mr. Amrhein.
Thank you, Eunice, and I'm going to, you know what? I don't use a touchpad. I should have practiced this earlier. I don't know how to right-click on this thing. I've got a little bit older laptop and I use a mouse most of the time. And then that is mine right there. There we go. Okay, I can.
You want that?
Yeah, I can go from here, yeah. I guess we're going to run with it that way. And this is a slide that we always start our presentations with, just as a reminder that we in MSU Extension really make an effort. We take it seriously, making our programs available to absolutely everyone without any kind of discrimination. And so here's the title slide, and I have to credit Dr. Lynn Harvey. Lynn was one of my mentors many years ago, currently retired, and he actually originally created this presentation. So we're going to talk about history and structure of local government in Michigan. We're going to focus on counties, probably a little heavier. That's where my depth of understanding is. And then we'll talk about townships, villages, and cities. We'll talk a little bit about funding and a little bit about citizen involvement. So what does local government do for you? Any quick answers from the group? Provide services? Okay, manages assets. That's another another good one. Providing services is really the key function. It's not the legislative body quite the way we think of state government. Now, a little caveat on this one. These numbers are a few years old and they may have changed just a bit, but this just gives you a sense of about 1,242 townships, 260 villages, and I'll let you read the numbers there. Cities, counties. We'll talk a little bit about school districts and authorities also as we go along today. Have you ever looked at a map and looked at the boundaries of some of these local units and said, why? How? How does this make sense? Every time, yeah. Well, there is some logic there, and we will talk about that, particularly with counties, how it is, why villages are formed, why cities are formed. I think some of that boundary business will become a little clearer. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, feel free to ask questions as you think of them. It's better to hit those kinds of subjects when they're on your mind rather than wait until later. Oh, and then we've got authorities and planning regions, and we'll talk briefly about those as well. They're typically a little larger geography. So we're starting with the Northwest Ordinance back in 1787, and we'll talk about 4 constitutions in Michigan, local control, and a number of those issues that are on that slide. So if we go back to really some of these founding fathers with Jefferson and his focus on direct democracy. And think about that one for a minute. Direct democracy takes me back to thinking about the Greeks, where they voted on every single issue. And they had colored stones, one for yes, one for no, and everybody took a stone and dropped it in the bucket, and that was how they figured out what they were going to do going forward. So that's kind of all the way at one end of the spectrum. The more centralized professional government was Hamilton's thing. We've got to have the pros running it, not just all of us ordinary citizens. And then Jackson was more about the citizen politician. Let's get folks involved. And so we've got a combination of those influences. So back to that Northwest Ordinance. And the slide there talks about the Treaty of Paris and Jefferson's role in this as well. And what we've got on the slide are the states that were in existence at the time, and we'll look a little closer then at the Northwest Territory here in just a minute. The Northwest Ordinance said we were going to divide that territory into 3 to 5 states, and you see those listed there. It established the rectangular grid survey. When you look at a map, most townships are 6 miles by 6 miles. And we'll talk a little bit more detail about that in a couple of minutes as well. Ad valorem is a tax according to the value. And so we use those kind of taxes on property is a key feature also in Michigan local government finance. And then they established in the ordinance some territorial legislatures as well. Some guaranteed rights for settlers in that Northwest Ordinance. Again, this was a federal act. Things like habeas corpus, due process, religious freedom. It prohibited slavery in the territory. Guaranteed statehood if you had 60,000 inhabitants. And the governor of the territory then would create counties and townships and appoint officials. Yes?
So 60,000 inhabitants, not women and not natives.
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that one. I would guess that might be correct, but I do not know. Yeah?
The authority to create counties and townships, was that only based on size, or was there some distinguishing element? What constitutes a county and what constitutes a township?
We will come to that in a couple of minutes. Each state, and a couple of us were talking earlier, with the original 13 colonies that became 13 states, were essentially fairly sovereign, and they joined together to form the United States. And so as each successive state was created, each state has a number of those powers similar to what the original ones had, which is a part of the explanation of why we don't have the same county structure in every state in the Union. That can be a little confusing. I've looked a little bit at Wisconsin's county structure, and it's fairly different. We have a book that describes county government in Michigan that I've helped to update. Wisconsin has a similar book, and there are a fair number of differences there. So imagine this is a township, and the basic structure is 6 miles by 6 miles, and so that's each of those squares is a square mile. Don't ask me where they came up with this numbering system. It's always seemed a little odd to me, but that's the system that's used. So the farthest northeast section is section 1 in the township. Section 16, those lands, in order to encourage education in the territory, were set aside in that Northwest Ordinance as being lands to sell to support education. And I don't remember if it's this slide or the next one, there's a little bit in the notes there about some of the early folks in Michigan who were working with that strongly supported that concept, but they saw what was happening in some surrounding states where they were selling those lands off to their friends and their neighbors and not getting a real good price for them. And so in Michigan, those sales were handled by the state of Michigan in order to get around that kind of a problem. Wayne County at one time was all of Michigan and a part of Wisconsin. You know, when there wasn't enough going on in the state to have more counties than one, that was Wayne. And as you can see, the 2014 map there, which hasn't changed since then, Wayne County is much smaller geographically than it used to be. So the next several slides are just a series of, over time, what the Northwest Territory looked like. And if you've spent, any people who are just really into maps in this group, kind of a couple, you might recognize the Ohio River down here along the bottom. You'll recognize the Mississippi on the west side. And so then Ohio became a state in 1803, and we had the Michigan Territory and the Indiana Territory that were marked out at that point. In 1816, Indiana became a state, and I don't know all those little historic details about why they drew some of those lines where they drew them. And then we had the Illinois Territory and what was left of the Indiana Territory. 1818, the southern part of the Illinois Territory became the state of Illinois. In 1834, we had our first constitution in Michigan. We didn't actually become a state until 1837. We'll get to that in just a minute. But you notice the Northwest Territory also expanded out to the Missouri River. In 1837, we got the, gotta be careful not to walk into the light too far. Y'all know where Toledo is on that map, right? And the smiles and the nods tell me you've all heard the Toledo story. We swapped a little land there to Ohio in exchange for the Upper Peninsula, which when you think about it in 1837, people probably just kind of shook their heads and went, what do we want that for? Today it's what? One of the jewels of the state. So the Wisconsin Territory was carved out then also in 1848. And so we had 84,000 people in the Lower Peninsula. Probably weren't very many other than natives in the Upper Peninsula at that point in time, I would guess. And this is mostly just some of the detail that we've already talked about. So there were some patterns of local government that were in use in some of the eastern and northeastern states that influenced the thought process about how to set up local government here in Michigan. The New England plan, think about New England, smaller states, settlements were a little more compact, there were more of those. The town or township was kind of the basic unit there. The Virginia plan, settlements were a little more scattered, a little more rural space. There was land granted there to individuals, and the county was more of a principal unit there. One interesting story there, I think it was Virginia, somehow they must have been calling that county territory or some portion of it a shire. And the guy who was kind of in charge was the reeve, and it was called then the Shire Reeve. Sound familiar at all? Became the sheriff. Yep. And then the New York plan, a lot of New Englanders in Western New York, so strong township influence. We also had some of that county strength influence as well. And so we've got more of a sharing, maybe sharing isn't the right word, division of power, some to counties, some to townships, with both being fairly strong in our system here in Michigan. And this is, we had a little discussion before we started earlier. These local powers, these local structures are really up to the state to create. A lot of it is based in our Constitution in Michigan, and then there's a lot of law in, we were talking about that earlier too, the Michigan compiled laws is that whole collection of statutes that we have in Michigan. And there are significant sections there about county government, township government, villages, and cities. And we'll get into some of those details here in a couple minutes. Constitutions in Michigan impacted this structure a bit as well. 1835 was mostly about individual liberties and self-government. We had elected county officials in 1835. And as I've looked back and thought about that, and the law that came about somewhere in the 1850 to 1870 range that allowed the county board to hire whatever people they needed to get the job done, essentially. That wasn't exactly the language. Kind of leads me to believe that those county-wide elected officials may have been the only county staff that we had in that early time period. And we'll talk more about those officials and that working relationship with county boards in a little bit as well. So in the 1850 Constitution, we established the Board of Supervisors, and that is the predecessor to the County Board of Commissioners. We'll get into that in a little more detail in a couple of minutes also. The 08 Constitution gave citizens a little more role and brought about home rule for cities. And in 63, we had a little more definition, but it also provided the option for county charters. When you hear that about charters, both counties and cities, it's an opportunity for either one of those units to elect, essentially, a charter commission who will write a charter which, within the parameters of the Constitution and the statutes, they can create their own model to an extent of how they're going to function and how they're going to operate in the city or in that county. Yes?
Do charter schools fit into that?
No, that's a charter schools. Let me think about that one a little bit. That is a different kind of a structure. Yeah. So this whole idea of local control, I think sometimes we get in our heads that we are the local government, we are the absolute authority. Well, that would be one end of the spectrum, and we're not there. We could be at the other end of the spectrum where the state really has all of the control, and that's not true either. So we play in that area in the middle. So we have power to act unless prohibited by the legislature and Constitution. And in some cases, the Constitution and the legislation is fairly directive. You will do it this way. In other cases, it's more permissive. You can do this. You don't have to. You can choose how you want to do it. And some examples of local, where you have more local control is in planning and zoning, for example. The state's not looking over your shoulder too much in terms of this is how you're gonna, they provide the rules of play without getting involved too much in how you're gonna do it. And they remove powers from time to time. Right to farm legislation, for example, says on my farm, there are certain things that I can do, and you can't zone me out of being able to do that, for example, or pass other legislation that prevents that. So this concept of this broad, grand design, counties are in a lot of ways kind of an agent of state government. The services that we see in counties are, I almost wanted to say same or uniform, but that's really not quite true. A lot of the same services are provided at the county level in every county across the state, for example. And part of the objective there, it's clear looking at the design, is to make sure that we have birth records, death records, a lot of the things the county clerk does, land records, the Register of Deeds office, are basically the same layout across the state of Michigan. So I can move, as I did, from Genesee County to Manistee County, and the way that all functions is going to be pretty much the same. Not so if I move to Illinois. Cities are designed to provide for an urban population at a higher level of service. And we'll get into that in a little more detail also. Townships are providing some of those same kinds of basic services, but we've got this different, more rural audience there. And then villages are really transitional from, we're in a township, we've got a bunch of us who live close together, we're not big enough to be a city yet, but we want to create our own sewer system. We want to create a water system. We want to have this additional level of services, and we're willing to pay for that. We'll talk a little more about the detail of how that works also in a couple of minutes. So counties, we'll start at that bigger scale. 83 in the state of Michigan. Anybody name all 83? If I sat down and spent about 10 minutes, I think I could, but it would take me a while. And that's because I've worked with counties now for almost 25 years. Wayne County in 1796 was the first one. We had 38 counties in 1837. And the last of the now 83 is Dickinson, created in 1891. Anybody know which county on that map is Dickinson? The red one all the way to the left is Ontonagon. No, Ontonagon's the town, it's Gogebic. It's not Gogebic. I learned that talking to somebody from there, it's Gogebic. It's a real short Gogebic. Yeah. You see the yellow one at the bottom tip of the Upper Peninsula? The green one to the left of it is Dickinson. No, the yellow one. No, the yellow one's Menominee. The green one is Dickinson. How did what happen?
Another story. Yeah. How did that happen? The last one was that.
I don't know that story. What I do know, given the history that Wayne County was once the entire state, whatever group, and let's just for a minute, the red one is Marquette, the yellow one is Menominee, the kind of purplish one is Iron. Crystal Falls is the county seat there. So let's just assume that maybe those were all one county, those four. I don't know that this is the exact story. And, you know, the folks down in Menominee said, well, it's time to have our own county down here. We're going to create Menominee County. And the folks in Iron County said, yeah, we're too far away from those people in Marquette. We need our own here. And finally, the folks in Dickinson County said, it's time for us to break free and do our own. And,
Did time mean population number? At what point in time did you become a county?
I don't recall ever seeing any kind of a, if I say that, it'll pop up on the next slide. Population may be a factor. I don't remember the exact detail there.
You had said earlier that most counties are 6 square miles, but obviously some of those are not.
Townships are 6 square miles. You'll notice, especially in the central lower peninsula, most of them are pretty square. Those are 4 townships by 4 townships. So they're 24 miles by 24 miles. That's kind of the standard county size. We wind up with, anytime the lakes come into play, we wind up with some unusual shapes and sizes. We'll talk just a little bit about those in a minute. And I don't have a clue what happened with Aranac and Bay and how Bay County is such an odd shape. Yeah, yeah. And you know, there might be a river in there someplace, or I don't know that one. So here's a slide we use in our, and this is probably a good place to interject on our new commissioner school for just a minute. No, I will come back to that when we get to the point where it started. But we use this slide in that one when we're talking to newly elected county commissioners. The largest geographically is Marquette, over 1,800 square miles. The smallest geographically is Benzie at 316. That would be a fascinating bit of history, I think, to see why it was. I mean, I see the geographic layout, the 24-mile squares. I can see kind of how that came about. But that one's small enough, it could have stayed connected to Grand Traverse. It could have connected to Leelanau. It could have connected to Manistee. I'd be interested to know why that happened. Another interesting difference that I like to point out is the population. Keweenaw County 2020 census, 2,052 people. That's 400 people per county commissioner. Think about recruiting county commissioners when you've only got 400 people to choose from. Wayne County is actually now not the largest county commission. I think they went down to 19, but 1,789,781. And I don't think this is in this slide set at all. Given that we've just gone through county commission reapportionment, which we do after every census, state law lays out 5 as the minimum across the board, every county. And then there are about 5 categories based on population up to a certain size. You can go up to 7, you can go up to 9, you can go up to 11, or you can go all the way to 21. And if I remember right, in a charter county, you can set up anything all the way up to 21. And so, boy, that slide's not in here either. It's been fascinating to kind of track. Since 1968, the number of county commissioners statewide has dropped every census, but the last couple or 3 censuses, the drop has been much smaller, like minuscule. I think we went from 622 to 611 or something, or 622 to 619. in the last go-around. I think we're kind of hitting that point where people are going, yeah, 5's good. Yeah, 7's good. Yeah, you know, Antrim's a good example of one that had stayed at 9 for a long time. I heard they talked about 7 10 years ago and didn't. And this time around they said, you know, it's time for us to just get this size down, and they went to 5. They could go back to 9 10 years from now if they wanted to. No, and that's not in here either. But and that's a good point, because you've got people, in light of the new redistricting process we have for statewide for legislative seats, looking at how come counties are different. Why is that not part of the process? For one, it's not part of the process because it's not statewide. It's at the county level. And that process says we take the clerk, the treasurer, clerk, register, and prosecutor. And then we take the chair of the two parties that got the most votes for whatever position that was in the last election. In my lifetime, it's been Republican and Democrat, and probably will remain that way until we have some other strong third party. And those 5 people, with a process that's clearly laid out in the statute, with 8 points in order: follow this, follow this, follow this, follow this, follow this. And when you get all done following all of those, the last one is, do not create it for partisan advantage. So it's pretty straightforward stuff. Yeah, I could go on for a while on that one, but that gives you kind of the introduction. Yeah, we're doing okay. So county government in other states, all but 3 states have county government. The terminology is different. Boroughs, parishes, some other kinds of names that some counties use. And commissioners have different names as well. So originally in Michigan, we had a board of supervisors. So we had the supervisor from every township in the county, and then we had a representative from cities, or multiple representatives, I think population dependent to some extent. In 1967, the U.S., actually there was a Michigan ruling in there that followed after the U.S. Supreme Court ruling, but essentially the one person, one vote ruling was applied to the structure that we had here. And if you think about it, if we had township supervisors serving, Township A has 1,000 residents, Township B has 5,000 residents, and Township C has 9,000 residents. They each get one representative on the county board. That's not really fair. That's not one person, in keeping with one person, one vote. So we had to have a change. The legislature came up with that in 1968, called the Board of County Commissioners, and laid out that process that we just talked about for setting up those districts. And then it became a vote with each of them representing a roughly equal population. 2-year terms, and in 2024, those will become 4-year terms. And I've heard people ask that question for 25 years. And Lynn Harvey, who created this presentation originally, one of my mentors, Lynn's answer always was, so wait a minute, you're asking that Cheryl, as a state rep with a 2-year term, vote to give John, as a county commissioner, a 4-year term. So in the middle of John's term, without giving up his seat, he could challenge Cheryl for the state rep seat? Not happening. And that's kind of the way it went for a long time, until folks at the Michigan Association of Counties had talked to other county associations around the country. Others had 4-year terms, same situation. That had never been a significant problem anyplace. And they really rallied the effort to, and a number of former county commissioners who also felt it was not a problem once they were state reps, really carried the water on that one. And we now have a change in the law effective 2024 we will have 4-year county commission terms. One of the big sticking points is that the clerk, register, sheriff, treasurer, and prosecutor are 4-year county offices. Do we have the commissioner election on the same year, or do we drop it in the middle? And it got into political arguments. It got into, if we put them on the same year and there's majority turnover in both, is there any institutional memory? Where we landed is we're doing them all on the same. There are not. Yes. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. There's a reason for these structure pictures, and we're about to get into it. So the role of the county board then is to establish policy and budget, essentially implement state policy, what we're told we have to do in county government, and connect with constituents is a good way to kind of summarize it. This should look familiar to you. This is a organizational structure chart that we're all kind of familiar with, and we tend to think in those kind of linear terms. We got the one person that, or the owners at the top, which may or may not be the board. They're calling the shots. The board hires the CEO hires managers. We have anywhere from 0 to 45 layers underneath this, and that's the structure. It's very linear in the communication that needs to happen. It can be very hierarchical or very working together kind of a structure, but that's what we're used to. So in county government, I laid out all of the players first with no lines, okay? We start to add lines. If we're talking about the legal structure, citizens help write laws. The laws impact the citizens, two-way arrow. The laws direct elected executives, administrators, departments to some degree, and those elected officials over on the far right-hand side. And if it's a one-way arrow through the rest of these, if it's a one-way arrow, that means it's like pretty much one way. The clerk doesn't get to do much with the laws that impact the clerk's role, is the point there. I used to draw this by hand on a big flip chart paper, and the director of extension, probably 15 years ago, was sitting in the back of the room one day, and he created the first kind of, on his laptop while he was sitting back there while we were doing the presentation. So, elections, the citizens are voting on some of the laws. When you have an elected executive in a county, they elect that person, they elect the board, and they elect all of those folks over there on the far right-hand side. That one's pretty straightforward. When we talk about supervision, day to day, somebody supervising others, the County Board of Commissioners does not supervise those elected officials. They answer to the Constitution and the laws and the voters. You see where we get into trouble once in a while? So none of those. They supervise the administrator supervises department heads, except every now and then when a county is first creating an administrator position and they get pushback from all the department heads, we kind of like what it's been like, and I know of a county that did this. They created a supervisor position with no management authority over the department heads. Handle all the other administrative roles. She did such an amazing job building working relationships in that county. They eventually went to having that supervisory role because it worked. This elected executive, that whole thing is kind of like three-branch government we have at the federal and state level. That's kind of like governor or president. at the county level. And that's why it sits off to the side. Finances. Oh, here's where the board has a little control. Those elected officials they can't control, but they determine the budget. And that's what the green arrows show. This was my attempt to point out that the only way this works with all these different goofy structures is we need good two-way communication all the way around the county organization. And there are some that do a really, really good job of this, which is fascinating to see. And then just for the fun of it, that's all of them together in one chart. So county government's a little clumsy. The structure looks a little unusual. One thing I didn't point out, because of that financial control that the board has, and we'll use the clerk as an example, the clerk is the supervisor over the staff in the clerk's department. That's called a co-employer relationship. The board and the clerk, or the board and the register, or the board and the treasurer are really co-employers of those employees. And that requires a whole bunch more good communication as well. We won't spend a lot of time on this one. These are the different forms. So bottom here is Charter County. Typically there's an elected executive, although you could do otherwise, and that executive has veto power. So it's kind of like a governor. The unified form is kind of this interesting deal. It's a different setup, but there is an elected executive option or an appointed manager option, and there's some veto power notes on the end. General law counties, that's kind of everybody else. And I'm going to jump to the next slide. And this one, I apologize, I pulled this out of another recent presentation, and the color background is weird, and I'm not sure what happened there. But the key things I want to point out, and I'll get into the lights, and that won't be good. 2 charter counties, Wayne and Macomb. In all the years we've had that option, those are the only ones. Macomb just did that in 2014, somewhere in there. The unified form, 2, Bay and Oakland, they both chose the elected executive. The county controller, the next line up, is an administrator that's hired under a specific statute that gives certain financial authority to that position and has a certain contract structure. And so that's, controller comes from the business world, and controllers were typically financial gurus there. And the numbers in those last couple of columns, we dropped one of those in the last 9 years. Somebody went back to being just an administrator. Or the person who collected the data didn't grill them and thought it was an administrator, and maybe it's still the other. The next is appointed county administrator. That's what we have in Grand Traverse County. That's what Leelanau County has. That's one thing that Kalkaska County is looking at currently. The thing to know, and that covers a whole broad range of, from that one I talked about before, where the person didn't have the supervisory authority, to that person having all of that supervisory authority over managers of departments. The county board can actually give an administrator those same financial powers that a controller has without going to the controller statute. In 9 years, we've gone from 33 of those up to 45. A lot of counties that didn't have one have looked at it and said, we as a board don't have the time. We're tired of a committee of us trying to manage a department head. We're going to hire an administrator. And so then the top one is nothing, or you kind of depend on the clerk to do a little of it, or maybe you formalize that and pay the clerk extra money. And that's where the change has gone the other direction. Did that answer there were a couple of questions earlier about county administrators. Have we pretty well covered those?
I just have a quick question. Is the size of the county
Short, question is, does the size of the county, thank you, I remember that. Does the size of the county influence this choice? Short answer is yes. And that, you can see the big counties are the ones that, for the most point, have gone to creating the charter commission, creating a charter. I can't name those 11, but I probably could list 15 counties, and the 11 would be in there. And I can tell you, because I have a presentation that I've given in several counties in about that same time frame. I could list probably 2/3 of the ones who made that transition in the last 9 years. And for what it's worth, there is an association of county administrators in the state of Michigan that does a fabulous job of supporting each other, answering questions for each other. I go to their annual conference because it's a great learning experience for me. Good folks. I think we have pretty well covered what's on that slide. There are a few others. Members of road commissions can be appointed by the county board or can be elected. That structure has to be set up by the county board, and there's a time frame in there. If they're going to change it, it takes a certain amount of time to get to it. Yes?
About the road commissioners, which direction is that, is it going? Are more becoming elected or following?
Question was about, are there more elected or appointed road commissioners? Which direction is that? And I have not tracked that at all. If you really wanted to look into that, the County Road Association of Michigan, I'm sure, would have that information. Yeah, I can't think of her name. Their director, I probably right off top of her head could tell you where that's at. There was a change in law 5-ish years ago where the County Board of Commissioners could also disband the road commission and make it a road department. And I think there are 3 counties that have gone in that direction. And beyond that, the details of why and how, I'm not familiar with.
I'm just curious, why is it necessary to have a drain commissioner?
Why is it necessary to have a drain commissioner?
Wouldn't that fall under a bigger department like the water and sewer or something?
At some point, I think somebody figured it just had to be an elected person that would answer directly to the people. That's one guess. There is a significant amount of knowledge there that's needed. There is a lot of direction in statute for a drain commissioner. These are things you have to do and you have to take care of. So I can look at it and kind of understand why it's that independent. There are people who look at it, and I can see this side too, and go, that person has way too much power. And I don't know, I'm guessing here, but that may stem from the fact that it's not cheap. When you're in Huron County or Sanilac County or Bay County, and you've got to dig county drains, big ditches, to keep that farmland drained enough so that you can still grow crops on it, it's a big deal. Up here, it's a big deal for a lot of reasons, but it's a different kind of a deal. My 120 acres up on top of this high sandy place is, it's not a sand dune, but it's not the heavy soil we had in Genesee County either. So it doesn't feel like as big an issue some places. This is just a list. I'm not going to read them to you. I'll give you a minute to scan them, but some of the other services that counties provide. And some of those are required thou shalt have courts. Thou shalt have public health. Thou shalt have, I think animal control is one of those. A lot of the others are either at the option of the county, or maybe you have to have it, but you have a lot of options within that in terms of how much you invest in those services and how you structure them out of, senior services. I'm almost there. I'm not real into the details, but my sense is the palette of possible services is enormous, and nobody can afford all of those. So you've got the power then within a county to figure out what's most needed in your county. Township government. One of the funny stories another one of my mentors used to like to tell was that here's the whole deal on townships and counties. Townships were 6 miles by 6 miles. That was the distance. Now go back mentally to the middle 1800s. Think about how far apart people were, how far it was to get any place. And he said, 6 miles by 6 miles, that's the distance you could walk to do your township business and walk back home in a day. Take care of feeding your animals on either end of the day. County, 24 miles by 24 miles, most of them, was the distance you could ride your horse and do your business and get back home the same day. I don't know if that was part of it or not. It sounds good to me. Another colleague once said, well, if that's the logic we're going to use, then we should, this is not my idea, this is being recorded, people will hear this. The idea was we should just abolish townships, make the current 24 by 24 counties the townships, make these regional entities that we have, planning and development region kind of thing, the counties. And I don't know if you eliminate much duplication or if you still have to have so many employees that it really doesn't save. I don't know. But that was kind of his theory, bringing that philosophy into the current era. So there are 20 states with township government. We've talked about the 36 square miles and the number, 95% of the land roughly, and I didn't put it here, but the caveat applies to that one as it did earlier. Some of these numbers, I didn't go through and update every little detail, so it might be 98%, it might be 92% today. About half of the state's population lives in a township, and population range roughly next to none. I think I heard at the last census that one little township on the tip of the thumb has 8 people in it. I'm not sure why you have a township, but that's their call. Yes?
So in Michigan, where is there land that's not part of township, that 95%?
Cities. And this is a good place the question was, where's there land that's not in a township? So if we go back to that big confusing map with all of the borders that were over each other, everybody in the state is in a county. Everybody in the state is in either a township or a city. When the need for services, additional services, gets so big that people say, we're going to spend this extra money, we're going to create this extra structure, we carve it out of the township or 2 townships. There are some cities where that's the case. And we create a city to have those additional services. We'll come to villages in a couple minutes. That's why that whole issue of annexation is such an issue in places. I've got a piece of property, I don't, but let's just say I've got a piece of property out in Garfield Township. And I'm happy being in the township. I don't want to pay the higher tax rates in the city. I can live without the extra taxes in the city. And then all of a sudden I go, I'm going to sell this, fund my retirement living on it, and the person buying it wants to build a business. And they need that better sewer access. They need some of those services. They want to be annexed into the city. What do you think every township, every one of those 1,242, give or take, in the state is going to do? We don't want to give up that land. We want to hang on to that. And that has led to, not so much lately, I haven't heard a lot of this lately, but over the years, a lot of consternation between cities and townships. And then we'll talk more about villages in a couple minutes. So townships, we talked about the 36-mile squares, when they were made governmental units. Charter Township Act in 1947, if you wanted to create your own charter, go through that process, add some extra services, add some more taxing ability, you could do that at that point. And there's a chart that as of a handful of years ago just gives you a sense of the difference in numbers. Board member size is always 7 in a charter, and the difference in the taxing levy. A mill plus any extra voted in a general law, up to 5 mills, I think at the discretion of the township board in a charter, and then additional with extra voted. And those tend to be the larger populated townships near cities who, for whatever reason, would rather not become a city. They're content staying with the township role.
So all townships levy 1 mil, no matter what, they cannot go below that.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one. The question was that all townships levy that 1 mil at least, no matter what. And I don't know if they have the option of going below that. And I don't know, you would think Headley would apply to that. And we'll talk about Headley in a few minutes. If Headley applies, then some of them have wound up a little bit below. Yes?
Aren't cemeteries also responsible, aren't townships also responsible for cemeteries?
Aren't townships also responsible for cemeteries? Mine is. A lot do. I don't know if that's absolutely required or if that just has developed over time. And I'm quite confident there are some privately owned cemeteries. But I know it is a common feature in townships. Yeah.
How is it decided who they belong to, like an island, if they belong to someone else or they become their own?
How does an island decide where they belong?
Yeah, exactly. Are they independent themselves or do they belong to another?
In Michigan, they would either be a county of their own or connected to another one. And because everybody is in a county. And in Michigan, there is not one that is its own county. Mackinac Island is part of Mackinac County in the Upper Peninsula. Beaver Island is part of Charlevoix County, et cetera. Yeah. So yeah, just a list of some more of the things that that townships do. Yes.
Are they required by law to do those services? Townships? I mean, is it listed somewhere as the law silent and that's just what they do?
It says responsible for.
Yeah.
I got a hunch they are required, but I can't say that with certainty. Most of my work has been with counties and now to a large extent with nonprofit boards just in the broader governance arena. And I haven't worked with townships as much, so I don't know that for certain.
So I have this question.
Okay?
I've been observing the county commission, and ever since I've been observing, there have been lots of conversations about workforce housing. The county should get involved But it looks to me like the townships are the ones responsible for land use and zoning. So the county, I'm not sure what kind of shape the county's supposed to, what they should do. What does that look like if they take on workforce housing? It just, I don't know, there seems to be why aren't we talking about that at the township level? I don't know, that's my question.
I don't know the sure answer on that one, other than, as you pointed out, when you talk about things like zoning, when you talk about building, when you talk about a lot of those things are in townships or cities. On the other hand, when counties get things like ARPA dollars, then that opens up that possibility, even though they may not have a direct responsibility. Yarrow Brown, Director of Housing North, would be, I haven't talked with her in great depth, but I think she would know the answer to that question. I think that's one of those areas that counties has some opportunities to get involved in some way, shape, or form with not as much direct responsibility.
Or even enforcement, because if the county doesn't zone, then what?
Yeah. Another point that raises, though, and it's on a slide coming up here somewhere, we in Michigan have a provision in the Constitution that I think is just absolutely genius. It basically says any unit of government in the state of Michigan that has the authority to do something also has the authority to work together with others to get it done. It's this like pretty much blanket authority to work together to do some kind of intergovernmental project. So if 4 townships around Traverse City and the city of Traverse City all had some direct ability to do that, they could get together and say, we're going to do this together. And if the county has some option to be involved in some way, shape, or form, they can also come in and partner and be a part of that effort. I don't know where that one came from, but to me that's, yeah. So the governing structure in townships is specified in the Constitution. They're 4-year terms, supervisor, clerk, treasurer, and anywhere from 2 to 4 trustees, so you have a board of 5 or 7. And some of this detail showed up in one of those earlier slides as well. The ability to hire administrators and appoint to various boards and commissions. And that's pretty much uniform across villages, cities, counties, all have a variety of additional boards and commissions that they appoint people to serve. Village government. This is that interesting one where, so we live in a township and there are couple dozen, however many houses, and we're kind of close together, and one day we go, you know what? We need a water system. We need a sewer system. We need, because there are a bunch of us here together. We want to do our own zoning. We don't want the township to do that for us. They can then create a village, and the key difference between a village and a city is the village is not separate from the township like the city is. If I live in a village, I still live in the township. I still get township services. I still pay for township services. And those extra services I want from my village, then through whatever the structure is, I pay for those services as well. And it's not unusual to see cooperation between a village and a township on some things. The village will go, hey, township, we're happy with the fire service. We're going to let you keep doing that. We're not going to get into that at all, but we will do X, Y, and Z. And so you don't get that knocking of heads so much over village creation. I'm sure it's happened somewhere a few times, but So only a handful of the 259, and that's another one of those numbers. There probably are a couple more since this was put together, but just a handful are charter. The rest are general law. I should have corrected that. Public Act 3 of 1895 is also known as MCL, and I don't know the exact number, but it would be something like 40.01 through whatever. And when Public Act 3 of 1895, you can look it up that way. You will find the act you're looking for. Public Act 116, which was a farmland preservation thing, everybody just called it PA 116 and it was no big deal. But when you look at the MCL designation, then you're really going to the current amended version rather than sort of referencing the original act from the past. So I've really developed a preference for MCL citations over the years. A little bit there on population range, 7-person elected council, and then they can hire a superintendent or a village manager. A little bit here on what the property taxes they can levy, how much they can do for particular services, and up to 20 mils for charter. And a list of some of the things that villages often provide. City government, we've talked about a little bit, 270 plus of them, wide population range, and we've talked about these other, there we go. And they do have some flexibility in their powers, their ordinances. This slide lists a couple of things that are typical across all cities. That must be what's going on. Yeah, I know how to use the arrows on the keyboard. You ever seen a track point? That little pencil eraser looking thing in the middle of the keyboard? My first laptop in 1995 had one of those, and I'm an addict. That's why I'm useless on touchpads. Okay, so a little bit about leadership for city government, several structures there, and I'm not real familiar with all of the details of the differences. And the charter will set up the election process then for the particular city. What was that? Oh, how did we get that? Because I pressed that one key too many times. There we go. I did learn how to click that thing. Okay, so anyway, there's some examples of city services as well. Authorities are another interesting special purpose governments, and a few examples there. Good example of that one is Cherry Capital Airport, which was owned by the two counties, and for a whole bunch of reasons, they decided that it made more sense to create a separate authority to govern that. Those two bodies typically, in those situations, appoint members to that board. So there's still some level of control, but it really hands off the governance authority to that new board. Intergovernmental cooperation. We've pretty well covered that one. How do we pay for local government? That pretty well covers the options. I will say property tax while that is an important one for cities and villages and townships, that is typically about half for counties. So property tax is a really significant one for counties. That's one difference there. All the financial records are public records. They're open to inspection. And we do have the Uniform Budget and Accounting Act that really specifies a good deal of detail about how local governments are to keep those financial records. Some basics on property tax. We've talked about most of these. You probably all know a mill is $1 worth of payment per $1,000 worth of value. How many of you are familiar with the difference between state equalized value and taxable value? I see a few heads nodding. I see a couple not, and we don't know about the people watching. So when the tax assessor looks at the piece of property and goes through their whole list of rules that they have to use to determine what the value is on that, they come up with a value. We take half of that, and that's what we call the state equalized value. And traditionally, that's what we taxed on, was the SEV. Until, and let me guess, I think it's about the next slide, yeah. Along came Proposal A in 1994, and that was in fact what created taxable value. And one of the key drivers behind Proposal A that really sticks in my mind was retirees, particularly in places like Leelanau County, with property that was accelerating in value, who were being taxed to the point they had to sell the home and find a cheaper place to live. And so this taxable value thing was created, and originally it said equal to the SEV, and the SEV continues to grow according to what the assessor determines as the value. The taxable value can only grow at the rate of inflation. And for most of my lifetime, that has, since '94, it's been this kind of a change. And so if looking at my farm, for example, I don't even remember the percentage. We've owned it since 1992. Our taxable value is much smaller than our SEV. And there are some interest, that helps us stay there and be comfortable with the property tax. And when we get older and we're living on whatever we have to live on, that'll be a great incentive to stay there. It does also cause people, though, to look at, well, maybe I want to move to a smaller home in town. Look at the price on the house. Ouch. Compared to what I can, oh my goodness. The taxes then, that cap on the taxable value goes away. And so there's that bump in the property tax as well. So it can be, it really worked to solve one of the problems it was intended to solve. It also, on the flip side, restrains income for the local governments and leads to some other different kinds of impacts on decision making farther down the road. Headley's an interesting one too. So the total value in the local unit, if that goes up higher than the rate of inflation, you do the calculation to the rate of inflation, and the millage rate has to be reduced to bring that total tax collection down to that inflation level. And so if you don't have that millage rate structured correctly, or you don't come back and revisit that because it expires on a regular basis, you can get to the point that, you know, your millage rate may have been 5 when you started, and you're only collecting about 3 mills after a period of time. Any questions on? on those. Just a lot of, and that's true of so much of local government. There's just a lot of things that, how many of us have ever made a decision in our personal lives and 5 years later looked back and went, oh, I didn't think about that. I wish I had. And I think that's true of an awful lot of our legislation at the state level as well. So Headley says voters have to approve increases. And I think, any questions on the rest of that? Oh, we are at about. Okay, so reform sign proposal. Okay, we've talked about, I think, all of these points. Federal money, another caveat, the 25% of the state budget, 11% of the local. I don't know that that's still accurate, but there are impacts, and federal dollars are dependable some ways and not so in others. City income tax, 22% presently, and generally it's 1% if you're a resident, 0.5% if you live outside the city, but get your income from inside the city. Which, you know, that's going to vary for most people. I've always thought that kind of made some sense. If I'm in the city all day long, 5 days a week, I'm benefiting from city services. Fortunately, my office is not in the city of East Lansing, so that's not an issue. Just a few notes there on state oversight. We've talked about a couple of those. One that I would point out to you that you probably are interested in is the Open Meetings Act. Are you familiar with the efforts that were underway late in 2022 to amend OMA? I see heads going both directions. There were two efforts underway. I've always thought OMA was fairly straightforward language. Compared to some laws, it's fairly straightforward. But there were some ways it could be simplified, and I did read one draft bill that looked like it did a pretty good job of reorganizing it, simplifying it so that it is a little more readable. The other one was about bringing back the video opportunities. And those failed to move on because of the turnover in the election. They're back, I understand, in a single bill being considered currently. Those are some questions we could just talk about, but I think we're about out of time. Some tips for you on being more involved, and a list of some of those commissioned and some other things we could discuss, and the authors. And I am going to turn it back over to Eunice.
We do have some other questions, and we have just a few minutes. Lauren Clark and Margaret, do you have some questions yet?
So one of the questions that I had, which you kind of talked about, but I'd just like to clarify it a little bit. I pay my taxes to my township, and then the township takes that money and goes where, and how much will get split between the different? And I know it's based on millages, but.
Yeah, your tax statement will list all of those different millages. Summer tax and winter tax are different, and the township then distributes those out to those various sources. If it's to the school, they get theirs. To the county, they get theirs. And so, yeah, you pretty much can look at those tax statements, and it will explain that to you.
This is a question about wetlands. Are wetlands governed mostly by townships? And if so, what do township authorities know about wetlands?
Repeat the question.
Question was about wetlands and who governs wetlands. I would say, I'm not an expert on that one at all, but it seems to me like there's a lot of that governance coming from the state of Michigan. I think there is some township authority related to that, but that would be a good question for whom? Let me think about that one. Drain commissioner? Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. Planning and zoning folks may be pretty familiar with those as well.
My next question is, what kind of training is offered or provided for newly elected trustees at the village or city level or county commissioners? Who provides that? Who pays for it? And do most new elected officials participate?
Last question first. Most new elected officials, I think, do participate at some level. At the county level, there is a new commissioner's school that we do in extension together with the Michigan Association of Counties. That's been ongoing since 1968 when we started the current county commissioner structure. And that is held every 2 years immediately following that election. We also, thanks to COVID and a lot of work, have an online version. So if one of you gets appointed to fill a vacancy in June this year, you can sign up for that and do that work. Most of it online. We had some great in-person conversations at the in-person sessions this year. The Michigan Townships Association does a lot of good education for township officials. Same thing with the Michigan Municipal League for cities and villages.
Have there been recent efforts to change or reform Michigan's local government?
Have there been recent efforts to change Michigan's local government? In large ways, not that I'm familiar with. I don't recall in 25 years hearing anybody step up and say, we need to cut townships in half, we need to combine all the township, nothing real big and structural. At the smaller level, a lot of that happens regularly in the legislature with signature by the governor. Specific issues, structural pieces that get changed, updated.
Thank you very much, Mr. John Amrhein.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a wealth of information. I found the history background very interesting. Many thanks also to our audience for tuning in and for being here today. Thanks to Aaron Olson from Traverse Area District Library and to Matt Kern and Joe Torrance from Traverse Area Community Media. There probably will be some evaluation forms somewhere here if you'd like to have some input. To learn more about our league, please visit our website at League of Women Voters, grandtraversearea.org. Upcoming March 21st from noon to 1:30 right here, we will celebrate Women's History Month, focusing on women leaders in our own community. Michelle Howard, Director of the Traverse Area District Library, Rebecca Pierce, Executive Editor of the Traverse City Record Eagle, and Brandy Ekren, Executive Director of Traverse City Light and Power, will present what has led them to their leadership positions now. Thanks again for being with us. Tell your friends this program is available for viewing on the Traverse City Area District Library YouTube, the League of Women Voters Grand Traverse Area Facebook page, and on Spectrum Cable TV channel 189 in Northwest Lower Michigan. Thank you for coming.